Awesome. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so let's take a big breath. Inhale, fill up the diaphragm. And nice slow release.
Okay.
Finding the bottom of that breath. Ooh, always feels so good. All right, cool. So, yeah, thank you so much for making the time. I know you're at work right now, so I really appreciate you just setting aside to kind of educate some of us about the work that you're doing. And I would love if you could introduce yourself because I think you'd probably do it best of kind of describing like what is a histotechnologist for those who don't know, and kind of yeah, what got you into the work you're doing now.
Yeah, for sure. So, a histotechnologist is someone who studies and performs different histology techniques. So, it to do histology, you don't necessarily need a certification, but to be called a histotechnician or a histotechnologist, it would require like that official job title would require you to be certified. So I am a certified histotechnician. My job title is a histotechnologist because I also do lab management and things like that. So it kind of puts me a little bit higher on the on that rung.
Mhm.
But histology is essentially just the study of tissues under like the microscope, so the microscopic view of them. Um, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just tissues. That's just sort of like the definition of histology. I can look at lots of other things that aren't tissues as well, like cells and stuff like that. But
Mhm.
how I got into the work I'm currently in was I actually used to work in a COVID-19 um, laboratory. So I was running like the tests on patient samples and then basically sending out results like you're positive, you're negative, or you need to retest because it was an inconclusive result. So I started there. And I sort of remembered when I was in school that I worked in a pathology laboratory, specifically veterinary pathology, and there was a histology lab as well. And so I had some of that prior like experience from that. And I just really remembered that I really enjoyed that work. And over time, doing the COVID-19 stuff, it wasn't really what I wanted to be doing. And I knew my calling was somewhere else in like a different area of science. And
Mhm.
so I actually started looking at my current job, not just my current job, but other places too, to be able to get the work experience. I already had all the education, but to get the
Mhm.
work experience to be able to take the test and be qualified. There's a bunch of different routes you can go, but the one I chose was basically like, I had all the education. I just needed more experience. So
Uh,
I found my laboratory, I applied, I got hired. It was still during like the height of the pandemic. So I was very, very like excited that I was able to get this position because it is exactly what I needed in order to learn everything that I currently know and just build up my skills. And of course, be able to be certified and take that test. So the lab I'm currently in studies postpartum young women's breast cancer. But we talk about breast cancer as a whole, and of course, like women's health and other areas of health, or just, people with that kind of reproductive anatomy. Um, so it's not exclusive, but that's the main focus. That's usually when we do all of our experiments, that's what we try to tie back into,
mhm.
um, is that area of research.
Gotcha, gotcha. So postpartum
Young
health,
women.
young
Yeah.
women's. So young women, would that be what age range would that be considered?
I think usually we consider it about like under the age of 45 roughly.
Okay, gotcha.
Um, so the other thing with the postpartum is that it's in a window of 5 to 10 years after your last pregnancy or earlier. It could be before 5 years. Let's say 0 to 10 years after your last pregnancy is our postpartum window that we look at.
Okay.
And then again, additionally, like under the age of like 45, maybe 50, kind of that premenopausal
Mhm.
time point, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, yeah. So I kind of see like your journey and where you're working into the role that you're currently doing, which is so excited to kind of rack your brain a little bit and pick your brain on some of the things that you have picked up on and learned, especially things that maybe people wouldn't expect. And I think it's like this topic of just postpartum health and maternal mental health and wellness is it's something that I think is getting more attention to it. However, it's like I think at the same time the quality of the like research and the funding and the investment in this group of people and on these topics is like still so like below par with what like we really are truly needing, I feel like. And so I'd be curious to know, like what are some things that you have noticed in your work, maybe just in a general sense, and then maybe we could like you could go into more of the specific things if there's something that comes to mind. But like, are there certain topics or trends, or health crises that you are seeing that maybe people would have no clue is like going on in this age range that you work with?
Yes. So the reason that my boss specifically studies that like specific group of people is
Hmm.
literally because um like these women that were considered young women premenopausal and had like got breast cancer within again 10 years of their latest pregnancy, they were
Right.
aggressively not surviving. Their survival rate was really really low, even though we consider people that are young to have a better chance of survival, right? Because they're young, or because they had a baby, that means they must be like healthier in some way, like they were able to support a growing a child.
Yeah.
And it was the opposite. It was they were telling like these doctors and everyone were telling these women that they're healthy, they're young, like this diagnosis, like you're gonna be fine. And then they were not fine. So the survival rates overall were really low, and they were also seeing an increase of specifically liver metastasis, which is basically like the primary site would be breast cancer. So it starts here and then it spreads to their liver. And the liver is obviously a very essential organ, and it's also a very like metabolically responsible organ. I mean, you need it to
Mhm.
survive. So having cancer spread to your liver is pretty much it's kind of I don't want to say like a death sentence, but it's pretty unsurvivable. Like the survival rates are just very, very low at that point.
Gotcha.
And again, people were not paying attention to women's health. They were not this specific area. Breast cancer, I think like I grew up and breast cancer was like on commercials. You might have heard of like the Susan G.
Yeah.
Komen Foundation, like the walks for breast cancer. And in those commercials, it's always pretty much like older women, postmenopausal women, um,
Hmm.
or just people with again that reproductive anatomy. It doesn't have to be that you identify as a woman,
Yeah.
but you that's what you would usually see. That's what people would think of when they thought of breast cancer. And you even hear today, like people that are, in like 18 to 25 range, or 18 even to 30, if they get breast cancer, doctors often are like, at first, they're like, you don't have breast cancer. Like, you're too young to have breast cancer, or you're just too young to have cancer in general, which is
Mhm.
kind of a very dismissive thing to say. And a lot of the time, when they are very dismissive and your doctors are very dismissive and don't do the testing, then you're just
Mhm.
delaying your ability to get treatment. and it's allowing your cancer to develop even further. So, um, my boss was someone that sort of I don't know, I'm not 100% sure how she noticed this kind of trend happening. But I would say the research and when she was able to prove that this trend was real, that this was an actual problem, with like the scientific data and everything like that, then she was able to secure more funding and then was able to go on and do more research and build her lab around this specific area of research. And she was honestly like the probably the pioneer of young women's breast cancer, and against postpartum, but honestly, just young women's breast cancer in general, because no one was studying it. And by the time that she was able to sort of secure the data, and be able to prove to the scientific community and honestly the rest of the world that this is a serious issue and people need to be paying attention to it, that was only like 15 years ago. Like it was a pretty recent discovery, um, that was established. And when that's really, to me, that's incredible and not in a good sense. It's almost mind blowing to me that that research is not as old as me. I'm 25, right? Like that research came after I was born. Which is a very and that is a very common thing you will see, um, in research in general. Is a lot of the things that we knew, um, that we know today also were things that we did not know beforehand. Like we only learned them within the past maybe 20 years. And we only really, really, I would say we only really started paying attention in maybe the last 10. Um, Even though people were finding these things, they weren't necessarily getting the most traction, right? So
Mm,
that is sort of the overarching, I would say, again, how my boss sort of got into this specific field and how I've come to like slowly learn that like we are not paying attention, uh, to
mhm,
women and their like their susceptibilities. They are, like we do have a different anatomy than men, and that has so many
mm,
implications. Anatomy and hormonal, like kind of whole body, is different than men. So that has different implications for so many diseases, for not just breast cancer, but just women's health in general. I know you just had another live stream, with Serena, and
mhm,
she or Serene, sorry about that.
yeah.
Um, and she mentioned, talking about birth control, that like, you know, what was it? What was she mentioning? Essentially that like it has more risks than people talk about, right? So we're giving people this medication and we're
Mhm,
constantly giving, women this medication and lots of other medications that
yeah,
were actually not thoroughly researched and not tested in actual like people like with that
mm,
female anatomy. And um they it just was under research. I think there's so much we don't know because they sort of just were like, oh well, it worked and they're not dying from it, or it's not necessarily like, completely adversely affecting them. Like they can still stop taking it and again get pregnant if they choose to. So whatever, like it's good, like we can give it to them. And I just think that that's very negligent. So I feel like the research has just been very negligent
mhm,
across the board,
mhm.
when the focus is just not on men, is how I feel about it.
Oh, wow, that is everything that you just said is really to hear you talk about the studies and the findings and what you have learned so far in your work is unfortunately, but I guess you know, not in a it's not something that we want to you know come to terms with, but it's also So to hear you talk about it, like the research science lens, is so fascinating to me. And in our kind of Western sphere, especially, I feel like until there is proof or data or quantitative numbers that are substantive and very, very objective, that it is never taken with the seriousness and the urgency that it should be until it gets to a point where we have like a huge crisis of big groups of people. And it sounds like your boss and what they kind of started the work in with postpartum cancer, especially in younger women, is one of those areas. And I can't imagine how many other areas, like you said, because the body and the female anatomy is just so different and responds so differently to all the stimulus of modern day and the hormones and the cycles that we run on. But yeah, I can't imagine like what other things that we will continue to see and that we're seeing now. Like you mentioned birth control, and I think that that's definitely something that I'm very concerned about with how easily accessible it is to people whose body and their biology and their physiology is really not developed yet. And there's no data about there's no information about how that might affect them down the line or their children if they should have children and their children in going forward. And it
Yep.
makes me think this whole conversation of um, like you mentioning how we have all these gaps in so many different places. And so it's kind of hard sometimes to pinpoint why this is happening. Also, because of the fact that, like you said, providers and just the medical structure that we have tends to gaslight and continuously dismiss over and over and over again. And so,
Mhm.
like, what do you think are some of the biggest barriers, and how would you kind of like see those barriers being approached when it comes to getting the data or like getting taken seriously for these issues? Like, do we need to have, is there a certain thing where we need to have a certain amount of like very clear data that a lot of times will have to be grassroots because no one's going to fund it until we actually find something? Like, how do we know when is it usually that these research studies are actually kind of gain some attention and some validation through like investment and funding and that attention that's brought to those subjects? Like, do you have to get like a certain study? Is there like a certifying body? Like, how does it work?
I think what a lot of it stems from is kind of how the education system works in research. So, in order to become a principal investigator or a PI, which is what my boss is, and like have a laboratory and be able to conduct the research that you want to conduct,
Mhm.
um, it's usually based on like prior research. So it kind of depends on where the PI is starting from and the experiences they end up having to where they slowly start like, building their education, their background, their science, their interests in the area that they're interested in. So my boss luckily was always kind of, I guess, interested in women's health. Um, and I think, like, it just slowly kind of like, not isolated, but it slowly came together towards, breast cancer and things like that, and, she knew that women in general were just, very understudied, very underserved, and this is kind of when she, made her, discovery about these postpartum young women dying from breast cancer, even though they were being told that they shouldn't be. That
Yeah.
was her solidifying thing. So it sort of is a community that builds upon itself. It depends on where you end up starting, what your interests end up becoming, and of course this was a male dominated field, so most of the research is done for men, on men, about men,
Mhm.
because that's scientists were not usually women, and if they were, they're not given as much credit anyway. They're not, all of that stuff as well. So culturally, it's a lot. And now that women are sort of, they're becoming more present in science, and they're sort of just like, we're here and we're going to start focusing on ourselves. That's kind of the big force, the pioneering like force that's really allowing us to get more research about women, for women, or just non-men in general,
Mhm.
because there's people that are actually interested in it. And it's also some important that are sort of here, at least in the US, our government pays attention, and like our health, like overall health in this country pays attention and is aware that women are underserved and understudied, and we need to be doing more. We need more funding and more money in order to keep like that momentum going, because it's not just enough that like the scientists are interested in it. There has to be some way, again, like you said, to kind of connect into like the financial side. Like, you got to have money in order to be able to study this. um so I think a lot of things have like a lot has changed in the past 20 years. And I think women have really just started like pushing back and saying like, we need to be a focus. Like, we need to be just as important as men when it comes to this kind of research. Um, and so that's probably the biggest thing, is like overall the attitudes have changed, the culture has changed, and people
Mhm.
are starting to pay attention. That doesn't mean it's like easy, and I think we are still so far behind where we should be, or where we could have been if people just cared, I think,
Yeah.
as much as they did about men, which is, I know, a little sad.
Yeah.
Um and it's taken like just a lot of like strong arming, again, like pushing back, a lot of resistance, and like um just like these women, like these female scientists, just not giving up.
Mhm.
And I think they're really the driving force. I'm not saying that there aren't, necessarily male scientists that are doing this work too, but you will probably see like the authors on these papers are not male names, for example. Like, they're most likely from non-men, because men kind of tend to care about their own, like their
Yeah.
own bodies and their own things.
Right.
Um, and it's very difficult to say like, what else can we be doing? Because really the thing that the average person can do is pretty much just, again, not just bring awareness, but like when you go to a doctor, um, advocating for yourself,
Mhm.
and other people like you, be especially your doula, like, and raising this awareness, talking to the people you work with, and making all of this very aware, because the more aware people are, the more that they can like advocate for themselves, the more that they can push back on the scientific community and say, like, we're not, like, we're struggling, like something is not fundamentally not right with this medication, with this birth
Yeah.
control. Why are, you know BIPOC people just not surviving so many things that white people are surviving?
Right.
There's lots of areas we could talk about.
Mhm.
Um, that obviously is a pretty important one to us,
Yeah.
um, for so many reasons. But
Yeah.
that's kind of where it is. It's kind of just, it starts from that, getting people interested in this area of health and research. And then it takes a lot to be able to go to school and to get to the point where you can study something that you think is really important and that you think matters. It's
Mhm.
really hard to break out in like the research field in general, but especially if like your interest isn't something that's necessarily popular. Um, a lot of the things you see that are brought up are like Parkinson's research, Alzheimer's research. There's some really like heart disease. Like there are some really big, like heavy hitters when it comes to research that are very popular.
Mhm.
And I think most of women's health conditions or like the focus being on women is not tends to not be, again, the popular thing. It does not tend to be the thing that most people go on to study. They just sort of stay in a certain general field. And I'm not saying those fields aren't important, but there's plenty of people on this planet to be able to start looking at other things and how it impacts women and just non-men. So
Mhm.
it's very difficult. It's a very difficult process, and there's so much that goes into it, and it's so intertwined
Yeah.
with our culture, our government, politics, people wanting to control our bodies, like
Yeah.
all of it matters. All of it will like absolutely matters when it comes to the science and the research. So there's no small like even like the smallest thing, even if people think like, oh, I'm just a person,
Yeah.
um, it's important that you are just aware and that when you go to your doctor and you're like something's not right, um, that you just are like, hey, I need help. Like I need help because we work with doctors. Like we like that feedback from a medical professional is where we start to see like the real change because if we don't know that people are having these problems, that people aren't again maybe surviving breast cancer and what have you, then we can't study it. So we also need to be aware of like what's going on. And again, because a lot of research is not being conducted on us in the first place, we often look towards like the medical community and doctors and physicians and all sorts of things like that in order to get an idea of like what the focus needs to be like why are people struggling, where are they struggling, what can
Mhm.
we do about that, how do we go about studying it, has someone studied it before, is there
Mhm.
something to go off of, so those kinds of things are really important as well.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing in this conversation on the just one by one, personal level of how people can get involved. And from what I'm hearing as you speak, a big piece is, yeah, that advocacy for yourself and also, yeah, prioritizing and taking care of yourself, which is something, of course, as a doula, I love to hear and talk about, especially when it comes to people with a womb and women's health. Um, because I think that is really where a lot of it will start from hearing you speak. I did hear like the theme of it's us showing up in the spaces to begin with, just point blank, like the scientists and the female-led research studies and teams, prioritizing and actually physically being in the space, which is that in and of itself. And like even talking about you as an Indigenous woman in the spaces that you work in and what you've been able to achieve, like that's a powerful thing. That's extremely powerful, just even being present physically embodied in that space. And so I love that you mentioned that as well, is like, sometimes it takes like literally we're showing up when we're knocking on the door. Like
Yeah,
we're here.
exactly.
And we're not going away. So what are you gonna do? You know what I mean? But no, I love that. And I think the advocacy piece is something I'm super, super passionate, even on my own health journey and working with my clients. Doulas never claim to be anyone's like saving grace, but what we do really, really like to kind of encourage is being somewhat of a guide in the facilitation of that advocacy so that you can practice and know that you are your first best advocate in every single situation, because you know your body best, right? You know what aches and pains or what weird feelings or sensitivities you may have, to medications or to certain movements, or things that are happening in the medical space, especially in a birthing space where so much can be happening. And I think that it's like it sounds like bringing that attention and that encouragement to not only prioritize and take care of oneself, but then to also vocalize and feel empowered to actually speak that out into existence, out into the world where other people are going to hear it, and like you said, where providers are going to hear it, most likely over and over again. And what I'm also hearing is you're talking about this kind of like down the chain kind of connection of almost like an ecosystem in the community. You said it's like a lot of these different aspects that come together and influence why we are or are not studying different women's health topics. And I'd be curious to dig in a little bit more about that kind of feedback between providers and medical teams and scientists, because I kind of just picture like doctors will put in like reports maybe, and then they'll compile it and then like email it to like a team. But I'm curious like what that actually looks like when a doctor or a medical team is working on a research study with a group of scientists, and then we of course have the actual patients, and a lot of other social determinants of like their health that go into it. But I love that we're talking about it like this because I think it is very important that we see it as that like circle. It's that connecting chain of like once we can speak up for ourselves, that actually does something for someone else, you know. And so like having the feeling empowered to say like, no, it's not just excuse me, a patient is coming into a doctor's office and saying like, hey, this birth control that you gave me, it's really like messing with my body. Like I really feel like I'm not having good symptoms with this. And then the doctor or the nurse will take those notes and it'll go into that personal like portal of that patient's notes. Um, how does it like in relation to a study or working with scientists, how does it work to actually get the data from the provider team? Like we have to have like those trials where patients like sign up for it, or is there certain data that is just accessible where we can look at trends that's also available for like say just like the public, so we can start to like gain momentum on like, well, scientists can gain momentum on looking further into these issues.
Yeah, so that's an awesome question. I'm gonna probably answer it in like two parts. So
Oh,
it's all interconnected, which is
mhm,
like like that's like the main point is like there's not
mhm,
one single thing um that a person can do or an institution can do. It's all interconnected. And that is absolutely like the driving point. I love that we're talking about like advocating for yourself, definitely advocates for someone else as well. And so really, again, even the smallest like thing that maybe most people don't think is important, it absolutely makes a difference.
mhm.
But to start, so when it comes to it really depends. So there is I'm just gonna take the example of birth control because it's such a good
Oh,
example of it. But when it comes to birth control, there is so much information out there already that it's a little bit easier to have that prior knowledge in order to like go ahead and like study that because there's so much research, so you can kind of you have background, like you have somewhere to start. The other thing could be like clinical trials. So all of these medications are supposed to go through like clinical trials and like approval to be able to be used. So the feedback that people that are participating in the clinical trials that they give and how that works for them is extremely important, and it will absolutely determine whether or not this is something that can be like given um, out to anybody like by a doctor. So clinical trials are one of the biggest ways that I think kind of involves researchers and clinicians, but it does take research to get there, right? Like you can't just go jump into a regular clinical trial. That's like one of the big areas I would say that really connects patients to doctors to researchers. Um, but before then, If there is prior knowledge on something, then we actually have a lot of doctors that go to medical school actually end up being researchers as well. They often participate, they might even run their own like research laboratories along with their like clinical side because they will be, working with their patients and they will start noticing like those trends. They'll start noticing people like complaining about certain things or they'll have their own interests that they want to explore more about to make like their patients' lives better, healthier, all of the thing overall well-being. So they participate, they're honestly really integral to research as a whole because they are the ones that interact with the patients. So they are the ones that can give us even more direct feedback. So a lot of studies often have like some kind of doctor or physician, like either they're also like on the research team or they're collaborating in some way um, to help provide information. A lot of the times, this is where the histology comes in. Um, Tissues, patient samples, so not just tissue, but any kind of like blood, urine, anything like that, any kind of sampling that's happening, you got to go to a doctor for, and they'll get that for us. Then we can actually do more like experiments on it. So it really becomes a collaborative effort in order to get all of the things that we need on the research side. We have to pretty much go through um, like a doctor. We're gonna have to work with these clinicians. So again, I mentioned that some doctors actually end up being researchers as much as they are uh, in the clinical side and working with the patients, they end up doing their own research. We have someone like that in our laboratory. So she is a gynecologist, and I have learned so much in the past year working with her. She's fantastic. And this is a prime example of someone who noticed that there was a big gap in a research area for women. And that happened to be a birth control gap, which is also why I think it's getting brought up so much in this conversation. So she pretty much noticed that with certain contraceptives, specifically an IUD, and I believe it's like a levonorgestrel IUD. Um, I think it comes in like the Mirena. I think if you know like that name,
Mhm.
that form of IUD, it's hormonal birth control.
Got it.
Um, that one, she noticed like there was not a lot of research done on like the effects of that with breast cancer. And so she decided to pretty much get her own grant funding, which she secured, and started working with our laboratory because we had the expertise about breast cancer in general to be able to help her. And so she actually works with another, like a plastic surgeon,
Oh,
and she is in the process of um, what where she's collecting tissue and sort of just optimizing her research. So
wow.
that's a big like this is like again, it's all intertwined and it's all like a collaborative effort because she she's not a plastic surgeon, so she is not able to get the breast tissue samples from patients herself. So she
Wow.
has to work with this plastic surgeon who is able to get these patient samples. She takes the samples, brings them to us, and we start doing the experiments. There's so many experiments. There's so many things we can do to this stuff. But it all started just because it was something that she um, became aware of and she recognized was just like not something people were working on that they were talking about, and she had the ability to again secure that funding and find a laboratory to work with to be able to conduct her research. So it's a really big collaborative effort, but it has to start somewhere. And for her, it did start there was already like background information about this um, contraceptive in particular. But, when you're working with patients, it becomes way more like interpersonal, right? So, no, just because we know that it's an underserved area research doesn't necessarily mean it's enough for some people to, I guess, kind of care.
Mhm.
But because she's working with patients and she's forming these kind of relationships, with these people, it makes it even more important for her to actually research this. Like she could just sit there and be a gynecologist and just keep working with patients. I mean, that's important work too. But she also knows that there is another way for her to give back and to help her community and help women everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, who may end up using, like, I think it's something like 88%, 80 to 88% of women or people with that female reproductive anatomy, have used birth control at some point in their lives. Like, it's a really high number.
Very high.
Um, Most people have tried it, even if
Yeah.
they're not currently on it now. Most people have, tried to use some form of contraception, like hormonal contraceptive that is, you know,
Mhm.
for that. I would say there's also the copper IUD, which is not hormonal, but it's more like a chemical, physical IUD. But anyway, so that's sort of coming back to, again, recognizing as a physician that there is a problem and caring about your patients, caring about this overall well-being, and being driven to actually use like your resources and just figure out like how can I study this? How can I make this change in my community? Um, that's it. It comes from patients. Like we have to
Mhm.
know that there's something going on, that there's something to be aware of, and when you advocate for yourself, that's kind of how it happens. I guess like from the ground up, like a completely grassroots type thing. That I'm not 100% sure how people get started when there is like no prior research. But I imagine that again, somehow, some way, it becomes obvious that there is a problem, right? It starts with people and it starts with recognizing like this is sometimes with rare diseases, like you'll encounter like a doctor will encounter a patient with a very rare disease and it requires them to do research for their patient in order to be able to try to help them. Sometimes that results in recognizing there is a new disease we didn't even know about, and we just found it, and now we can actually start researching it that way. If it's something more prominent in the community, it will, I think, like the kind of thing with human nature is that it will come to light, even if it hasn't currently, it will eventually make its way
Mhm.
into like our, I don't know, like our view, like it will
Yeah.
come into our view and we will be able to actually study it and do something about it. But
Uh-huh.
of course, this requires people. It
Yeah.
requires people to, go to a doctor, which is not always the easiest thing, and to advocate for themselves and to also have the language to be able to explain what's going on, you know?
Mhm.
That's also really important in terms of like education and something that like doulas are a really big part of, something that birth workers are a really big part of is just sort of giving people that extra bit of knowledge to be able to say like this is how my body feels, like, and being able
Mhm.
to describe that um to a doctor is really really important because
Yeah.
saying, just saying like your stomach hurts um is obviously a concern. I would not dismiss that, but the more specific you can be and the more language you have to be able to describe how you're feeling. Um, and I know sometimes birth workers, I even advocate for the people they're working with, like for them, if they're not able to like kind of do that, be like that
Mhm.
bridge between the
Yes.
patient and like the doctor. So that's like extremely important as well. There's definitely like people that are like medical advocates on the behalf of another person.
Mhm.
So extremely important because the more information you can give a doctor, the better, and the more people, I guess, like, that you can get behind, like, more support you can get to kind of, if your doctor is really stubborn or doesn't really want to pay attention, the more heat you can put on them, the more you can push back on them,
Yeah.
the more, like, you can help that person, and the more that you can help that community, like your
Mhm.
community, because you're not letting it go. Um, and I know it's like it's so difficult to, keep pushing even when you're exhausted, even when you just don't have the energy. But if you have the ability to do so, I can tell you, like, it genuinely does make a difference, and it
Mm,
it really does bring a lot of things to light, and it really shines a light on, like, these kinds of issues that we're having, because the more
mhm.
that, if we don't brush it under the rug, the more people that speak up and push back, the more they have to pay attention,
Ye
um, even if they don't want to. And I
yeah.
know absolutely there are doctors that don't, want to pay attention, and they don't have the greatest, like, doctor patient relationships.
Mhm.
um, I think it is getting better, and it's definitely possible to find doctors to care. And I always know that, like, when I have talked to people and they have had, like, negative experiences, with physicians and, like, um, any kind of medical thing, even if it's not necessarily, even like your dentist or your eye doctor or
Mhm.
something like that. When they do find someone that cares, it means so much. It really does. So I encourage people to keep fighting and to keep trying, because it's worth it to yourself. Like, you owe it to yourself to be like the best version of yourself, to not be in pain or to
Mhm.
minimize your pain, or to be healthy and feel like a whole person, and not just like every day you're showing up and you only feel like parts of yourself. So,
Yeah.
as difficult that as it is, um, that's something that I encourage people to do to the best of their ability. And if they can't do that, then, um, I try to advocate as much as I can for them, or like finding people that can advocate for you because you're exhausted. That's
Yeah.
that's what community is. Like, even if it's not a medical person, like your friend or your family member, having them go with you to help advocate for you can be really helpful.
Mhm.
Um, I've seen the benefits of community coming together, to make a person's life easier, to make everyone's life easier. So it does come down to community needs to be an essential part of research. Um, Collaboration does not work the way that people say it works. They like to say, "Oh, we're collaborating." As scientists, we often say we're collaborating and we're working together and all of these things. And it's like, we're working together because people want to get something out of it, right? Like,
Exactly.
there's something they want to get. They're not always doing it just because it's for the greater good or for really
Mm,
morally great reasons, right? They are doing it for sometimes selfish reasons or self-serving reasons, or because, again, they're getting something out of it. And that results in collaboration, I think, that is not really very effective, because I feel like you really have to have a sense of community in order to have effective collaboration. You have to be doing it for reasons that aren't selfish, in my opinion. And I
mm,
think science should not be driven by how many papers you get out or how much money, like, you can get. I mean, obviously money is kind of required, but, it should not be about your legacy, and it should not be about, like, the name you're making for yourself. I'm not saying achievements aren't important, and I think everyone should be recognized for the work that they do because it is important. But if
mhm.
that's your only reason for doing it, then, um, it's very difficult to have purpose in your research and have it ultimately have really important meaning. I think when you don't think about your community and you don't think about the world as like a whole, and you start doing research, you're missing, like, a lot of the times I see people that miss so many areas. This is how you miss, like, you just end up ignoring women's health for many, 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 many years
Mm,
because you just aren't you aren't concerned with your community. Like, women are in
yeah.
your community, and you have to care about them in order to study them, in order to try and make their lives better and healthier. And you can't, if you're just in science and research just because you want, I don't know, some level of recognition or what have you, and whatever your reason being, that's that's how we end up losing out on
It goes
a lot of,
right.
just we just lose a lot. And it's funny because the people that do care, the people that are here, because they have that kind of similar belief of like, I'm not in it for like money, I'm not in it for fame, I'm in it because I'm genuinely trying to help people that are like me, that aren't like me, and what have you. They oftentimes end up kind of getting pushed out. Like, they don't end up getting to the point where they get to be a PI and, like, lead a lab and do the research they wanna do. So that can be really difficult, is that until the attitudes and, the culture around, like, the science community and the academic community really start to undergo, like, a massive transformation, I think we won't see super bit we'll see more, we'll slowly start to see more research being done
Mhm.
for, like, our communities, but it will be very slow going. Like, there
Yeah.
needs to be, like, a big shift, and a big restructuring of how we look at science and
Mhm.
how, we conduct research and, like, how, like, the academics work, because the academic system, in my opinion, is not supportive, and it's very flawed, and, I think we lose a lot of good people simply because of that,
Mhm.
and because there isn't support for, like, the things that they wanna do. So, very, very tricky situation. It's very difficult to, like, tie all this together and get, like, that forward movement to
Mhm.
where we are, like, helping people and we are, like, making a big difference, because it is so hard to make a big difference.
Yeah.
It often is just, like, little
And
itty bitty steps.
without driving yourself into the ground and, like, sacrificing so
Exactly.
self. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense that it's this integration. I can't, the word that comes to mind as I hear you speak is like the intersections
Yeah.
of all these areas that you're discussing and different people's roles within that ecosystem. And I also, yeah, I'm just like nodding my head so much hearing you speak because I'm like, yes, 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 like that makes sense. Like that is putting to words what I feel like a lot of women's sentiments are when it comes to health and just in general, when it comes to trying to be a functioning person in this society. I'm sure we could go into so much more of, talking about like cultural aspects as well and how it might be a little different in other countries or in other research spaces. But what I have really, really found is that like you're speaking to the academics, you're speaking to like the spaces in which researchers, scientists, and providers cultivate their understanding and their lens of the world and the patients that they work with, and the kind of the soil that they are planted in a lot of ways is already not a fertile one. It's already one
Mhm.
that is very depleted, and maybe exploited and truly like can only sprout and blossom certain kinds of like plants, right? Because it's been already like diminished time and time again.
Yeah.
And I see that as the a lot of the academic space for sure. Like I think that this conversation really reminds me of just how, like basically, I think that providers are trained in a way to where they're more concerned with being right, quote unquote right, that they completely miss the point altogether. Like you said, it just
Yeah.
kind of goes woo, like right over their head, because they're so concerned with the consult that they're giving being correct and being so like um, so controlled and could not be any other thing, because that's how
Yeah.
American culture is. I don't know if you've ever read the book Braiding Sweetgrass, but it's basically she's a biologist, yeah, and she
Mhm.
talks her intersections of studying plants, and it really reminds me of hearing you speak because you're talking about your experiences in the science realm, and how there's so many intersections that are missing when it comes to community, when it comes to people, when it comes to just the overall understanding and perspective that people have of like health and well-being, and she was saying like I think it was in her interview to be able to go into the biology program at her university, and she was talking about something that had to do with like the beauty of I think maybe marigolds or some plant that she really loves, and just talking
Mhm.
about like basically like saying why they want to go into the fields because they really adore these plants. And then the biologist was just like, yeah, that's not biology, like that's just wrong, like I don't think you're in the right path here. um and I'm just like, it just really reminds me, reading that book recently and then hearing you speak because, like you said, it's like the whole system restructure, which it seems to be kind of moving that way, is something that like is desperately needed, but it only has come to that with the unfortunate situation and sacrifices and illness and health conditions and really just suffering that a lot of our community goes through, women, especially BIPOC communities go through, to the point where like we're actually it's something tangible, it's something real that people look at, and I think it's so upsetting on so many levels that it even needs to get there. But I am hopeful to hear you speak and talk about your work because I see that there are people in our corner, at least in the spaces, doing the work and educating and encouraging others to do so in their own capacity. So yeah, just like thank you so much for sharing all of this, like kind of behind the scenes of the work that you do and like how you got to where you are today. Um, I'm seeing like a lot of themes around advocacy, community, the intersections of the ecosystem that is health and wellness, and what really goes into building a person up to feel that the best that they can, like you said, is
Yeah.
something I really hope that continues to move in that direction and understanding that what we do impacts others, and like how I feel about myself is a vibration. It's an energetic frequency that can go out and ripple into how I carry myself in the world, and vice versa, how other people treat me, and how they treat themselves. So I would love to kind of like just to kind of end up here and wrap up here, know if there's any other things that you want to touch on, or what maybe you would want people to know, or resources that you might be able to point them in the direction to kind of learn more about some of the topics that we talked about today.
Yeah. So you're welcome, by the way, but thank you so much for having me, like, talk. I don't usually, get it outside of my work, I don't usually get too many chances to really, like, get into these kinds of things. Of course, I talk about it, with my community and people all around me, but, to be kind of on a bigger scale is, like, it's it's different. It's really, really cool, though. But yeah, so in terms of resources, there are so many ways that people can kind of get involved in terms of I think the simplest way is just to get as much information as they can. I think going to your doctor, like when you do go to your doctor, asking questions, learning as much about your body as you can, learning like, about your anatomy and, like, the ways in which maybe you can improve, like, how you're describing, like, what you're feeling,
Mhm.
so that you have a stronger language in order to, um, advocate for yourself when you are approaching your doctor and things like that. Um, I think it's important to take care of yourself and not just in terms of going to the doctor. I do think it's important to go to the doctor, but taking your care of yourself in other ways. And I know that you really talk about like nourishing your body in all sorts of ways and like your mind. And I think that having that really good like mind body connection, being really solid with yourself and comfortable with yourself, having that self love is just going to it's going to take you further, and by taking you further, into, like, your health journey, it takes other people because it is all we are all connected whether we acknowledge it or not. We are all kind of living on this earth together, and, just by taking care of yourself, you can honestly help take care of other people. And,
Mhm.
honestly, if you don't take care of yourself, then you can't take care of other people. You can't help your community if you aren't feeling well. So first of all, I think just like in terms of resources, find out like what works best for you. So getting your mental health together. I know social media is a really, really big thing for most people. And sometimes there are really, really great like resources through social media to get connected. So honestly, that's probably the easiest place for most people to start, just
Mhm.
because most people have social media. So kind of doing some research through that avenue and finding, a couple accounts that really resonate with you and like certain ideas that really resonate with you. For me personally, I really like the pelvic floor physical therapy type stuff. Uh, and that because that's just an area that's important to my own health and wellness.
Mhm.
Um, I think we both I personally started, like, following some doulas. You're one of them, so
Mhm.
there you go. But,
Yeah.
Marissa, who what is her I think it's Intuitive Doula on Instagram. So
Mhm.
she was kind of the first person I think I started following, in terms of, like, birth workers, and I just felt a connection with that in my own life, so that encouraged me to again, we attended that event together, so then we met, and it just kinda builds from there. So, sometimes it could also be in your own community, like, talking with people that are nurses or in the medical fields to get like more language or to kind of just like stay up to date about what's going on. If you can attend like an event about like reproductive health and things like that, or just health in general, health and wellness in general, that can be a really really great way to do it. You can just go online. I think not everyone will probably want to like delve into actual like research papers, but you can if that's something like you're interested in. I think research papers can be really difficult to dissect.
Mhm.
And I actually think the validation of a lot of them is not as good as as we would like them to be. So I'm not
Mhm.
even gonna say that like, you have to go read all these research papers because it's not necessarily the best resource. I think it's better to find something in, like, that's more readable and
Mhm.
really just finds, like, the meat of what's in those research papers and presents it
Okay.
to you in a digestible way rather than
Mhm.
trying to, like, do all of that yourself. But you absolutely can. It's just I think some people are like, "I don't have time to read, like, and digest a whole research paper," and it's like, you don't have to, because there's so many things out there, like infographics and even just talking to your doctor, talk to people in your community, let like, maybe have, like already have that grasp on that type of stuff. There's so many other ways that are just easier to connect with, health and wellness that just are not just science, like, it's all based in science in some way, um, and what was I gonna say? It even if something doesn't necessarily have scientific research, because culturally, you and I both know that like we, rely on things that maybe like science hasn't really researched yet or science hasn't studied yet, but we
Yeah.
know work. Like
Right.
we know that this helps us, when we're
Yeah.
doing something. So it doesn't have to be like 100% a medication or rooted in science to be valid. And
Mm,
that's something I would encourage people is like have that holistic approach
I
um,
love it.
to their health. So I know I don't have maybe necessarily like specific examples, but more I'm just listing like realistic, like
Yeah.
life things you can just do
Yeah.
that I think are really helpful. And and you can start small. Like you do not
Yeah.
have to suddenly transform. You're working out 5 days a week and you're doing all of these things. Like take it like one step at a time and think about, okay, at this moment what's like something I would really like to focus on. Like if you're having difficult periods, for example, a difficult menstrual cycle, maybe that's something that you can try a couple different things and see if you can make that a more like pleasant experience or just a less stressful and painful experience.
Mhm.
um, Even like if you have the ability, having that sort of grace with yourself and taking a day off of work or not feeling bad if you need to take extra time to take care of yourself. That was a big lesson for me this year, was understanding that
Okay.
working 5 days a week is really, really hard. And it's very easy to get burnt out. And I have started taking more time off and kind of just giving myself feeling less guilty about taking care of myself, because I think in our society they want worker bees and they don't necessarily um not everyone necessarily cares as a whole that you know um you're taking care of yourself. Like they want you well in order to work. And that's not necessarily the point, right? Like that's to me,
Right.
that's not really the point of health and wellness. Like
Yeah.
you should be healthy for you, and because it's important. It's important
Yeah.
to be a whole person and to be the best version of yourself that you can be. So not to go to work 5 days. I'm kind of bashing on it a little bit because it's a lot. Like I see so many people so burnt out at this point that it's like its own like epidemic, like its own like pandemic of people being just freaking
Yeah.
exhausted. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think that the best thing people can do is just focus on themselves and take care of themselves. And once they have gotten to a point where they have kind of done that, or they're ready to branch out and do more for their community, that's fantastic. So I think just start small, do everything that you can do that within that reason for yourself, and that's different for everybody. And that energy will end up flowing out into the world. And I think it will help make the world a better place. When you feel better,
Mhm.
when you feel like a person like yourself, it makes the world a better place. So
Yeah.
that's to me the most important thing. I think people might be expecting me to give more of a scientific answer. But I honestly think like science is conducted by humans, and humans have to
Yeah.
be their best selves in order to do this kind of work. So
Mhm.
it's going to start with the individual, and it will eventually come together, I think, in that community level. And
Yeah.
that kind of then, maybe like an entire country level, like community can be
Yeah.
different levels, different sizes, but
Yeah.
it does. And to me, you really do have to take care of yourself first in order to take care of other
Yeah.
people. So that's probably my best advice. Um,
I love it.
yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so, so much. I have so much just so much gratitude for this conversation and everything that you just shared too. I think yeah, it's definitely a very American thing to see that maybe someone's in a certain role and expect them to be a certain way. And I think that you are symbolic of the fact that you are doing this work and you are in a space that maybe not a lot of people who look like you are in as well, but you're still really like rooted and grounded into on an intimate level to yourself of like, yes, I'm here to do the work. I'm here to like help my communities and, I'm showing up, but at the same time, like you're not sacrificing yourself for, for the sake of everybody else. And I think that I totally 100% agree that no matter what role or line of work that someone is in, if we don't have the certain level of spiritual groundedness to see things clearly, nothing that comes out of us can then be a clear thing either. So, not to say that we need to be perfect, or like you said, start working out and, getting back into a grinding, hustling sort of culture where we're trying to be perfect. I love that you said it's really a personal thing. It's getting in tune with that mind body connection. And that's what it's like look like for you. And I'm sure it will be super helpful for reminder for others to hear as well. And speaking of, I would love to end off how we began, if you'd like, with one deep breath. And then I guess I could send you off into the rest of your workday, even though I'd love to keep you longer.
I know. We'll probably do this again, I'm sure.
Please.
Yes. But yes, let's go ahead and do our little sign off, and I would love to do another deep breath. So we can definitely do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, we could just start by filling up the diaphragm. Big deep breath in, and nice slow deep breath out. Just kind of processing, unraveling everything that we just talked about. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Um,
too. This was
thank you so much.
amazing. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
You're good. No, you're totally good. I will send the link so that anyone that you want to share it with can also watch what we talked about today. But yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you again.
You're welcome, and thank you as well. It was really, really nice talking to you. Honestly, an hour flew by. And
I
yes,
know.
I will share the link for sure. So,
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. All
bye.
right. Bye.